We're in Isaiah chapter 29. And if the projector ever gets booted up, we'll have the outline back up here. But basically the idea here is Israel is being faced with the question of whether or not they should be making an alliance with Egypt. And Isaiah in chapters 28 and 29 has been talking about the spiritual principles that go into that decision. We read verses 9 through 14 last week regarding the blindness of this rote religion. This thing that's condemned here, be delayed and wait, blind yourselves and be blind. They become drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. For the Lord has poured over you a spirit of deep sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets, and He has covered your heads, the seers. The entire vision will be to you like the words of a sealed book, which when they give it to the one who is literate, saying, "Please read this," he will say, "I cannot, for it is sealed." And then the book will be given to the one who is illiterate, saying, "Please read this," and he will say, "I cannot read." Then the Lord said, "Because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with this people, wondrously marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed." What kind of images does he use to describe what's wrong here in the 9 through 14? What are the people like? They're drunks. What else? They're staggering.
Like the blind man that said, "I can't see, I can't see," and the guy says, "Open your eyes."
Yeah, I know. They're like
amazing.
They're blind. They're drunk. Anything else? They cover their heads. Good.
They're willfully illiterate, ignorant.
Okay, the illiteracy thing. We'll talk about that in a second. Those are just kind of a hodgepodge of images. Basically, everything having to do with altered perception or distorted perception. And really, this is kind of parallel to what we saw back in chapter 28 with the woes against Ephraim, because both sections talk about drunkenness and both sections complain about the defunct spiritual leaders. And both sections talk about how the people are really refusing to listen. Now this statement in verse 9, "Be delayed and wait," could also be translated, "Astonish yourselves and be astonished." I'm not particularly dogmatic on which way to go. But there's this stupor, if you will, this drunkenness and this blindness kind of mixed together. Does it remind us of anything that we've seen much earlier in Isaiah, this concept of blindness? Maybe back when he had his first vision, somewhere around there, chapter 6. Nobody remembers? It's one of the most important statements in the book. In chapter 6, whenever Isaiah sees God in the temple, and there's the seraphim going around, and Isaiah says, "I am unclean, I live among a people of unclean lips." And the angel touches the coal of fire to his lips, and he is cleansed. And then he's sent with a message, and that message is what? Anybody remember? Keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes dim. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. Isaiah 6 and verses 9 through 10. This is that kind of this spiritual blindness. And Isaiah indicates here that it's really kind of a self-inflicted injury that the people are bringing on themselves. The reason that they don't understand the message of God is because they don't want to. This deep sleep that God has put on the people, they've refused to hear God, so God has taken away their ability to hear. They've refused to see God and what He wants for them, so God has taken away their ability to see. It's interesting how this is actually quoted in Romans chapter 11 in verse 8 to talk about the Jewish rejection of the gospel. In Romans chapter 11, Paul makes a statement in verse 7. He says that what Israel is seeking it is not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. So there you have a quote from Isaiah 29 and Psalm 69. But the point of both quotes is the same, that there were going to be a remnant of people that understand the gospel, and then there was going to be a much larger segment of people who were blind to the whole thing because they're too interested in pursuing their own course of actions. It's kind of interesting to think about. Does God force people to listen to His words? God kind of shove it in their face and say, you're going to deal with this no matter what. Well, no, not really. If they're genuinely uninterested in what God has to say, then God's not going to force them to have this relationship with them. God will allow them, you want to choose the path of foolish ignorance? You want to choose the path of destruction? Go right ahead. You don't know what you're doing, but go right ahead and do that. It's, in some ways, a testament to the love of God that He created us with the capacity to do that, but it's really it's a no-brainer choice, but people make the choice that seems to require no brain. So that's how it goes there. Now verses 11 and 12, he makes a comment about this sealed book. The entire vision will be to you like the words of a sealed book, which they give to the one who is literate, saying, please read this. He's going to say, I can't do that because it's sealed. They give it to an illiterate person, and he says, I can't read. What's the point of that?
Well, it's obviously they're making excuses. Kind of reminds me of Moses at the burning bush when God told him, you're going to be my spokesperson to go speak. And Moses starts making excuses. Well, I'm not a good speaker. I can't do that. And that's kind of what these people are doing. I can't do that. I can't understand this. Lack of trying.
That wasn't how I interpreted it at all, actually, but I hadn't even thought about that. I don't know, maybe. I have to think about that. I had taken it to be, no, God has, since they've rejected the Word of God, God has deprived them of any further knowledge of the Word, that is how I've taken it. But you may be right about that. That honestly hadn't even occurred to me.
Okay, yeah. And that really is the extension of that. To him who has, more shall be given to him. Right. Who hath not, even that which he hath shall be taken away.
Well,
so it's because of these people's willful ignorance, God's going to just say, okay, you're not going to get any information. I agree with that. So,
there's this kind of... it's a restatement of what's already been said in verses 9 and 10. Blind yourselves and be blind. You're going to stagger with this drink and whatnot. And then he kind of restates the same concept in prose. You've got this whole vision, and you got these prophets among the people, quote unquote, and they can't read the vision of God because it's like a sealed book to them. And it's sealed, they can't open it, so they're stuck. Well, maybe they can give it to an illiterate person. Well, no, that's stupid because illiterate people can't read. So what's left? Well, the answer is that if the teachers don't know anything, the whole society's kind of sunk here. It's a famine for the Word of God, as Amos chapter 8 and verse 11 talks about. The people will not listen, so truth is taken away from them. This sealed scroll actually reappears in Revelation chapter 5. I don't know if it's really being used the same way there, but there's still a concept there that this revelation of God can't be opened by anyone on the earth or under the earth or in heaven. So, John weeps because we've got this sealed book. Nobody can read it. Except somebody can open the book to us all, and that's Jesus Christ. So it's kind of the key to breaking open this ignorance on the part of the people. I am disappointed that no one tried to, argue the Mormon view on this text. There's a...
What What is that?
Well, no, this is, the Mormons have two favorite proof. The Mormons have absolutely no evidence for the Book of Mormon being foreshadowed anywhere in the Bible, so they have to sort of scrounge for proof texts. And there's one in Ezekiel 37 about the two sticks, but this is another one of their favorites here. The Mormons will say, well, the Book of Mormon's incomprehensible to the educated person, but Joseph Smith, he had a third grade education, and he could still read it. And the problem is it doesn't even read the passage correct, because it says no, the illiterate person can't read it any better either. So that doesn't really work. It's also a blatant violation of the context as well. There's nothing in this passage that I can see about a new revelation at all, but rather the removal of revelation as a judgment against those who are already failing to listen to God's words. But every now and then, the Mormons, at least in my discussions with them, they pulled this one out of the hat, and it's just kind of, have you read the context surrounding this? Well, it's, but I guess you got to scrounge for proof text. In verses 13 and 14, the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Therefore I will once again deal marvelously with this people, wondrously marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed. There's a cause and effect relationship here. Because the people's relationship with God is defined by saying the right things, well, but their heart's not in it, what's God going to do? Well, yeah, okay, that's what they're doing wrong, right?
Here again, he's basically saying, I'm going to take it away from them. A marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hidden.
Right.
In other words, since they don't really want my truth, they just want to, by rote, repeat it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take it away from them.
Right. And so there's this kind of this idea of, you think you've got me figured out. You think you can just say, the X number of right words and everything will be okay for you all. Well, I'm going to take everything that you know and everything that you think, and I'm going to completely destroy it, God says. I'm going to replace it with something else. That'll show you. And there's, a great theme throughout the Old Testament about how ritual is not a substitute for a true relationship with God. Micah chapter 6, for instance, in verses 6 through 8, the prophet writes about this subject that with what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Is it going to be solved by me offering all these extra sacrifices? No. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God.
Oh, but the Old Testament was just a law of works. Now the New Testament is the law of the heart.
Har, yes. There's Mark being the devil's advocate again. We just finished Deuteronomy on Sunday morning. If anybody still thinks that the Old Testament is entirely about the mechanics, there's no hope. I'll just say that now. Because there was a lot of talk. What was the foremost commandment in the law? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And, this relationship with God is concerned with. He's not just simply, fixated on all the externals and all the mechanics and all the details. He's concerned more about the hearts of His people. Psalm 51 in verses 16 and 17. You do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Now what does that mean? Does that mean that God didn't want the people offering sacrifices? Well, no, because He sort of commanded them, right? So why does David say that? You don't want sacrifice. It's not because it's ultimately not what God is primarily concerned with. He wants the hearts of His people above all else. The rest of that falls into place once the hearts are in the right place.
Remember when God sent the plague on Israel in the days of David, and He came to the threshing floor of Araunah, and He said, I would buy your threshing floor and your oxen and so forth to sacrifice to God, and Araunah said, they're yours, take them. He said, no, I will not offer to God that which costs me nothing.
Yeah, that's another good one to go to, yeah. Huh.
You know, I'm going to do this thing right, or God won't accept it. And that right means it's got to come from the heart.
We've seen this kind of talk before in Isaiah, haven't we? Back in chapter 1, when he says that, what are your multiplied sacrifices to me? I'm starting in verse 11 of chapter 1. I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. When you come to appear before me, who requests of you this trampling of my courts? You're wearing out the carpet, basically. Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. That's the same word that he uses about homosexuals, actually. It's not very pleasant at all. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the solemn assembly. I hate your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. So when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. You can't pray to God with your hands in the air if your hands are covered with blood. God's going to see that, obviously. You can't live a life that is entirely inconsistent with the worship of God and then come into His house and His temple and expect to, get away with that. Are there implications for that today? Of course there are. It's you can fill in the blank on that. But, Seth, you got something?
I was wanting to go back.
Oh, yeah.
But I just find it really interesting that he describes what God's going to do as marvelously, wondrously marvelous.
Marvelously, wondrously marvelous, yes.
And you think, well, just how great and exciting and wonderful is this going to be? Because wondrously and marvelous sound like good things. They sound like God's about to bless, but in the context here, God's about to judge. We have the same words used like in Exodus chapter 3, where Moses is seeing the burning bush and says, I need to go see what this wondrous thing is, this wonderful thing, this marvelous sight. When God does marvelous and wonderful things, doesn't always mean that the people are going to get exactly what they want.
No. Marvelous does not mean that you're going to like it or enjoy it. And we'll talk about that in a second. I want to look, because this passage is quoted, portions of this passage are quoted throughout the New Testament, which is what's so cool about it. Matthew chapter 15 is where I want to go next. And Jesus is here, gives them an earful about their traditions. Some of the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. He answered and said to them, Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, Honor your father and mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, Whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever I would have that would help you has been given to God, he is not to honor his father or his mother. By this you invalidate the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites! Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as teachings the precepts of men, or teaching as doctrines, really, I guess. Now, Jesus is clearly... There's something interesting about the way Jesus quotes this. Was Isaiah specifically talking about the Pharisees in Jesus' day? Was he making some kind of prediction about that? No, not in the original context of Isaiah 29. He was talking about the people of his own day, wasn't he?
Stubborn people are stubborn people no matter where they live.
Exactly. Stubborn people, whatever generation you live in, there's always going to be people like this.
The attributes of Phariseeism existed in the days of Moses.
Yes. Well, yeah, and they still exist today, Isaiah, so it says something interesting about the use of the word prophesy even. Jesus says Isaiah was prophesying. Prophesying doesn't mean to tell the future, it just means to speak the word of God. Isaiah isn't making some kind of prediction to say, now, 700 years from now, there's going to be this group of traditionalists that the Messiah is going to have to confront. No, that's not Isaiah's point at all. Because his language isn't even predictive. He's talking about his own day. But Jesus says, yeah, Isaiah was talking about you. And it might be appropriate in certain circumstances, if somebody's behaving the way they did in Isaiah's day or in Jesus' day, to say, Isaiah was talking about you too. You're the ones that he was talking about here. Fundamentally, nothing has changed. You hear people in their vocabulary, they'll sometimes call somebody a Diotrephes or something like that. It's the same way of speaking. We adapt ancient language for specific situations in our own day. Anytime we exalt tradition to the level of God's Word, anytime we bind traditions on others that the Bible has not bound, anytime we forsake what God has said to hold on to our traditions, because that's the way we've always done it, well, we're in the same category as those rulers from Isaiah's day, as those Pharisees from Jesus' day, those hypocrites that Isaiah spoke about. Well, what did the people do that was so bad? Well, ultimately, what was that horrible thing that they were doing that made their life inconsistent with what they were worshiping God as? What's the situation behind Isaiah? Yeah,
they had nothing to do with God. They weren't listening. They weren't obeying in their heart. They weren't doing everything.
Right. But specifically, what were they doing that was so bad that Isaiah is just jumping all over them here? We're coming up on it a little bit in chapter 30.
Running to Egypt.
They're running to Egypt for help. Which, it's just like, wait, what? That's what you're getting all upset about, Isaiah? They're trusting in your human solution to save you. Well, yeah. And that's probably the worst crime of all. Mark.
We could use the one word idolatry.
Yeah.
Which covers this. Egypt had become their idol.
And they had. They bought into the lie that if all we got to do is align ourselves with the correct political group, and everything will be good. And that'll somehow make our predicament better. No, it won't. And of course, the brilliance of this is that if you had tried to accuse them of not trusting God, well, what would they have done? Well, they'd have pointed to their diligent temple. Look at this diligent temple attendance, and look at our commitments to keeping the sacrifice. We clearly trust God. We go to church on a regular basis.
We tithe mint, and cumin.
But that's how easy the trap is to fall into. You can be coming into this building. You could be coming into a worship assembly like this on a regular basis and still not trust God the way Isaiah is talking about, because you're so fixated on what's wrong on the outside and how you can use your human solutions to fix it that you've missed the real answer, which is God Himself. And so since they were quote-unquote religious, it had become okay to invest themselves in love affairs with secular powers. Are we any different today? No. The relationship with God is defined by the do's and the don'ts, but they haven't really comprehended Him. Their tradition has become equated with their religious devotion, but they don't really know God. They don't have a relationship with Him. And so because of all of this, because everything's like a sealed book, because the people are totally blind and drunk and lost, what is God going to do about it? Something marvelously, wondrously marvelous. God's going to intervene into human history. He's going to take everything that you think you know, everything that you think you're so smart about, and He's going to completely destroy it. He's going to take every human product, every human idea, and obliterate it. Now, what does He do that's going to just totally rework our entire thinking here?
Prophesying to Judah.
Yeah, He's prophesying to Judah, okay. What does He do to resolve the Judean crisis here?
Destroys them.
Well, He doesn't. Well, eventually He
takes them all away.
Well, eventually He destroys them. That's more Jeremiah's context than Isaiah's. But first He destroys the Assyrian army, which is kind of big intervention, big deal in chapter 37. And so, in one sense, verse 14 is fulfilled in the destruction of the Assyrian army. But we would have gotten their attention. Maybe it did get their attention for a little bit, but Manasseh messed everything up in the next generation. So this more permanent solution is needed. So where is this really fulfilled? What is the wondrously marvelous act that God does to destroy human wisdom?
The scheme of redemption.
Jesus, yes. In doubt, the answer in Bible class is always Jesus. And we know that this passage is fulfilled in Jesus because Paul explicitly quotes it in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18, the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. That's Isaiah 29:14 being quoted. I think he's quoting the Septuagint version, but it's basically the same passage. That's the cross right there. It's a message of destruction. God takes the most foolish concept that any human could imagine, a God dying for His people, and uses it to destroy everything you thought you knew about human wisdom. And to the Greeks it's foolishness, and to the Jews it's a stumbling block. But to those who are being saved, to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God. He is the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. There is no greater example in history of foolishness destroying human wisdom than Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Yes, Seth?
I like how Paul ties this passage here, that I'm going to do something that you're not going to expect, with the stumbling rock that he's already mentioned, that's already mentioned in Isaiah already, right? About how Jesus is going to be the stumbling block to the Jews. These two things are tied together in the same.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of brilliance to the way that Paul ties this in. Jesus is at the center of everything in all of this message, and it's everything that just doesn't make sense to the human mindset is encapsulated in the idea of a crucified Christ. So when Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God to salvation, well, you got every reason to be ashamed from a secular standpoint. You're telling me to believe that a Jew in Palestine was crucified and nailed to a tree and, died within just a matter of hours, and you're going to tell me that He's the one that's going to save me? He's the one I'm supposed to put my trust in? He's the one that I'm supposed to declare my allegiance to? He's the God I'm supposed to worship? Well, yeah. That's the message of the gospel right there. The message of foolishness to the world, but it's the power of God to us who are being saved, because Jesus didn't stay dead. He was raised from the dead. Now, any comments or questions up through verse 14 of Isaiah 29? I love this passage. There's probably more we could say about it, but verses 15 through 24. Woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord, and those whose deeds are done in a dark place. And they say, who sees us, or who knows us? You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? That what is made should say to its maker, He did not make me. Or what is formed say to them, He who formed it, He has no understanding. Is it not just yet a little while before Lebanon will be turned into a fertile field, and the fertile field will be considered as a forest? On that day the deaf will hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind will see. The afflicted also will increase their gladness in the Lord, and the needy of mankind will rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. For the ruthless will come to an end, and the scorner will be finished. Indeed, all who are intent on doing evil will be cut off, who cause a person to be indicted by a word, and ensnare him who adjudicates at the gate, and defraud the one in the right with meaningless arguments. Therefore, thus says the Lord, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall not now be ashamed, nor shall his face now turn pale. But when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they will sanctify my name. Indeed, they will sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and will stand in awe of the God of Israel. Those who err in mind will know the truth, and those who criticize will accept instruction. All right. So he starts off with another woe statement. We saw that in 28:1 and in 29:1. So what's the main thing he's condemning here in verses 15 and 16?
no better than the one who created them. Essentially, I was reminded as I read
Nobody
this
ever thinks that. No.
about, and I can't remember who it was that supposedly said it first, but he probably stole it from somebody else. He said, when I was 16, my father was the dumbest man ever walked the face of the earth. By the time I was 26, I thought he was the most brilliant man that ever lived. It's amazing what he learned in 10 years.
Yeah, really.
All of us have gone through that period where it was actually an embarrassment to us that our parents existed. We just didn't think they were all that intelligent. And then as we grew up a little bit more and got a little maturity, we began to realize our parents knew a whole lot more than we did. And this is kind of the attitude that these people have toward God. God made them, but God doesn't know anything. He doesn't really understand.
What do you figure it means when it says that they're hiding their plans from the Lord? How do you even do that? You can't hide anything from the Lord. Which means these people think they can hide something from the Lord. That's the problem. God isn't really watching us. Where'd you get that idea?
Kind of like that song that, I can't remember who it was. I heard sing it first, that God is watching us from a distance.
Oh, that's the, isn't that like a Bette Midler
song.
thing or something? Yeah, I've heard that song. Well, it's all these insulting questions. Who sees us? Who knows us? The Psalms talk about the fool has said in his heart there is no God. And the point of the Psalm isn't so much to talk about atheism as it is to talk about people that think, God's not watching me. They don't take God into account. It's the same as the rich fool in Luke 12 who says, I've got all these plans for myself, and the idiot didn't take God into account. So God says, you fool, this very night your life is required of you. Then what will become of all the stuff that you've stored up? God's response here is, no, you turn things around. No, you have it backwards. You've got the potter and the clay confused here. They're not interchangeable relationships. The potter has complete authority, complete right over the clay. Paul talks about that in Romans 9. And just like things that are made cannot question their maker, things that are tools cannot wield those who are wielding them. It's like Assyria, the rod of its anger, boasting that he'd accomplished something. The issue is authority. What God makes belongs to Him. And God can do flat out whatever He wants with it. Keith. Okay.
The Lord said unto him, I'm using King James. The Lord said unto him, now be ye inward part did not he that made that which is without?
Basically it says the same thing. You Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but inside of you, you're full of robbery and wickedness. You foolish ones. Did not He who made the outside make the inside also? It's interesting, actually. The context, he's, again, hand washing. Seem to butt heads with them over that a lot. But it's the same concept. That they've exalted their traditions so much, they've made themselves the authority. It's the same thing going on in Isaiah's day. You've got potter and clay backwards. You've forgotten who's in charge here. Forgotten who's, who made you? Well, God did.
I think verse 41 there in the text we just read has to be drawn into that. But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. So they were giving what was on the outside and thinking that God couldn't see inside.
Right.
No, you give the inside.
Well, that's good. I'd have to look at that text some more, but there's some good points that can be made there. But the issue is authority. What God makes belongs to Him. He can do as He pleases with it. He has the right. God has the right to point to something and say, this is good, and He has the right to point to something else and say, this is bad. And God can do that. God has the right to give life, and He has the right to take it away. And So all this confusion that the people have gotten into, they thought they're smarter than God, and they've got life figured out in the way that God doesn't have. Well, what's God going to do about it? Verses 17 through 24. What kind of things do we see here?
Turn Lebanon into a fertile field.
Okay.
Lebanon was their enemy.
Lebanon becomes a fertile field. What else?
The deaf are going to hear, the blind are going to see.
How's that going to happen?
Be glad.
Okay, deaf hear, blind see, afflicted people are happy. What else? I mean, what does this sound like?
Beatitudes.
Beatitudes. It's like it's opposite day, isn't it? You know, all the stuff that used to be one way is reversed. It's kind of like, God says, oh, you're going to reverse the potter and the clay? Well, let me show you my own set of reversals here. I'm going to take Lebanon. I'm going to reverse its situation. Lebanon was a forest. It's going to be turned into a field. The deaf are going to hear. The blind are going to see. You also see how that kind of answers the dilemma that we started with about, people who are staggering and they're blind. Oh, no, God's going to make some people see. It's like Jesus said in John chapter 9, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who are blind may see, and those who see may become blind." Again, directed at the Pharisees who were claiming they saw, but they remain in blindness. And this is really just an unpacking of all these reversals are really just an unpacking of verse 14. This wondrously, marvelously wondrous thing that God is going to do. The traditional understanding that humans have of what works is going to be removed. It's going to be obliterated to make way for God's ideas. He's going to take foolishness and make it wisdom. He's going to take wisdom and make it foolishness. Lebanon, that symbol of pride and glory, is going to be cut down and humiliated. The closed book, that closed book we were all getting all upset about, it's going to be opened. And the deaf are going to hear the words of it. The curse of chapter 6, where people are told to, render their hearts dull, their eyes dim, their ears insensitive. All of a sudden, that's going to be reversed. The message will be accepted. The darkness will be turned into light. Everything is now backwards from what it was. The afflicted and the needy rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. The false and the unjust judges are overturned. You got to like that there. The person who was defrauded with meaningless arguments. How often does that happen today, how many junk lawsuits do you think our society is going to go through? We can go back and forth about how to put an end to that, but there's only one way that's going to stop, is when God intervenes into human history and fixes it. Mark.
Thinking of Ahab and Jezebel here, how that they used false words to steal the vineyard. And I can't remember the man's name.
Naboth.
Naboth, yes. And what was their end?
Well, eventually.
God took care of it.
Eventually God destroys them, yes. And in verses 22 through 24, we see that the patriarch of the past becomes a pattern for the children of the future. No longer will... Well, Abraham is... It's interesting. Abraham's described as redeemed here. Which, people like to... The Jewish people in particular like to put Abraham on a pedestal. He's the father of the faithful. But Abraham wasn't perfect. He's just like the rest of us, really. A man with a nature like ours who was just as much in need of redemption and justification as the rest of us were. And it's the same thing with Jacob. Jacob was not a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination. But Jacob no longer has a reason to be ashamed because his children are now described as the work of God's hands. And so we have salvation, we have praise, we have a new understanding of God's Word in these last few verses. Those who err in mind will know the truth, and those who criticize will finally learn to accept instruction. There's that great epic reversal there. That brings us to the end of the chapter. Any thoughts, comments? Seth?
The Holy One of Jacob in 23.
Well, Isaiah uses this title, Holy One of Israel, a lot. In fact, I think Isaiah accounts for well over half of the occurrences of the Holy One of Israel in the Old Testament. Probably more than 75% actually, now that I think about it. But here, the Holy One of Jacob is just a variation on that. It's a name for God, but it's probably a name for Jesus too. I mean, since Jesus is God, there's I don't know if Isaiah has, specifically some kind of messianic implication in mind here, and this idea of the Holy One of Jacob just ties into the fact that God is holy.
How else is Abraham going to be redeemed from the children of Jacob going to be seen as children of God unless they are redeemed?
Right.
I don't know.
Well, okay.
It seems like it's there.
Yeah. Okay, well, and there's a lot of good lessons we can get from this chapter, questions about how we view reality. Do we derive our information about the world around us from something other than God, or do we derive it from God Himself? How do we view authority? Do we think humans have the answers, or do we think that, that God has the answers? Even so-called experts in their field really know very little when it's all said and done. How do we view ourselves? Are we wise? Are we intelligent? Are we so much smarter than everybody around us? Well, we need a reality check if that's our mindset about the whole thing. The great act of foolishness that God's going to perform will turn any wisdom that we have into foolishness on its own. If we have the correct view of ourselves, we realize that even the most brilliant genius in today's world is but a sniveling crybaby before God, an absolute worthless individual who cannot hope to contend with the Almighty. We also realize that the only hope of exaltation comes from humbling self and taking up the cross and following Him. That brings us to the end of chapter 29. We'll pick up next time with 30 and the alliance that they're not supposed to have with Egypt. So, appreciate your comments and discussion.